Bolshevik party, and a not so much an architect of, but rather an advocate of the new economic policy, which was a structure for the economy that would bring the wrecked Soviet economy back from the destruction wrought in the Civil War from 1918 to 1921 by using some degree of market mechanisms and trying to unleash some of the dynamic entrepreneurial potential of the Russian people. Now, this doesn't mean a kind of neoliberal privatizing effort, but it did want to turn away from an overly bureaucratized and arguably necessary during the context of a civil war communist, fully planned economy, to one which relaxed some controls. And so we saw in the 1980s that Gorbachev begins to draw upon that equity of ideas that was resident in figures like Bukharin and Preobrazhensky and others from the 1920s, who thought that that was the direction to take the economy. Now, this wasn't just, of course, Gorbachev that was thinking in these terms. It was also Gorbachev's mentor of sorts, and of course, I'm referring to Andropov, who was the former KGB leader and then later General Secretary of the Soviet Communist Party himself, who succeeds uh, Leonid Brezhnev, and recognizes that Brezhnev had in the 1960s and 1970s just left all sorts of areas of the Soviet economy neglected, that there were problems in terms of transportation, rail networks that, while vast, were in sore need of repair, really, really bad roads. So just a very basic understanding of a need to repair the country's infrastructure and to just shake up the bureaucracy a bit. Now, uh, going back to, well, why did we have this period of some stagnation or lack of dynamism, yet one which is remembered quite fondly by many of the elderly in the former Soviet Union, that being the Brezhnev period? Well, one of the things that happened during Brezhnev's rule was that, one, Brezhnev recognized that you really wanted to just kind of take care of the bureaucracy. That would make them happy, and therefore that would keep your power intact. So, that meant that there were not going to be as many positive pressures that are needed to affect change, but also the discovery of the vast oil and gas fields in western Siberia. And that provided a huge store of wealth that the Soviet Union could draw upon to cover its trade imbalances and also to build up its military and provide some degree of consumer goods, while failing to focus on innovation in their own country. And then, lastly, it should be remembered that the experience of World War II, it is just so deeply ingrained and burnt into the psyche of the Russians. So they really reconstructed their entire economy, both in the 1930s, anticipating World War II to some extent, but certainly following World War II to survive World War III. The assumption within the Soviet Union was that there was World War I, there was World War II, and that the Germans would be back likely in another generation. So you build an economy to survive World War III. Well, how do you do that? One of the chief assets you have is a dozen time zones. So you spread things out over this vast expanse of territory that the Soviet Union comprised, so that if you were ever attacked, enough of your industry would survive, and you would be able to take the initial hit and then eventually counterattack. Well, that model, while arguably good if you're preparing for World War III, was a bit of a disaster if you were trying to construct an efficient economy. In other words, you were building in inefficiencies on the score of transportation in order to have some greater degree of survivability. Well, Gorbachev inherits all of this. And Drop-off, as we know, was ill and old when he assumed power, and so he didn't have enough time to implement the reforms that he wanted to put in place. And of course, he was followed by this Chernenko fellow who was even more ill and more elderly and did not last very long. And then, of course, we see this need to put forward a new kind of leader. The Politburo decides to put this guy that's 2 years younger than I am now in charge of everything, who is Mikhail Gorbachev, and he begins to attack these problems in the way that he best thinks is the route to go.
So let's talk about what Gorbachev actually did in terms of policy and the way that I want to frame this because we have limited time. So the way that I want to frame this is if you could explain for our listeners and viewers, if you could explain what was glasnost, how successful was it, what was the impetus for it, and contrast that with what was perestroika, what was the impetus for that, and how did that play out, and maybe the interplay between the two. And let me just explain very quickly before I let you talk on that why I'm asking this question, because there is serious debate even among leftists and Marxists who are critical of Gorbachev. There is serious debate on the question of glasnost versus perestroika, and many who would argue, and I would as well, that glasnost was extremely positive and perestroika extremely negative. And so let's talk through what these two things were, how they interacted with each other, and ultimately what conclusions we should draw from those results.
Okay, so just on the most rudimentary level, I mean, glasnost was an opening of society, right? So introducing democracy and removing this sense of fear and the idea that conformity was the only way to get by, was to keep your head down, keep your nose down, and not get into any trouble with the authorities. Well, from Gorbachev's perspective, this was an yeah, well, let's use Reagan-esque terms. This was an evil in and of itself. But more than that, one could not have socialism. One could not have socialism in the context of a society that did not have openness. And so we see that Gorbachev invites this openness. And as you know, there was this great flourishing of ideas and of conversations regarding how the country should be managed. And one could make a case. I would even make the case that the Soviet Union, in say the year 1990, was the most democratic country in the world. Very very briefly. Given the range of debates that were taking place, now coexisted, of course, with a still really existing oppressive state apparatus, but one which was being marginalized, a security apparatus. But in terms of liveliness of discussion regarding social, political, economic, cultural matters, I mean, it was unparalleled. Just to reference the experience of a mutual friend of ours, Boris Kagarlisky, who you did a fine interview with a week ago. Boris was elected to the city council of Moscow in 1990. This is no small thing. I mean, Moscow is a country in and of itself. It's huge, both in terms of its population and the resources that it commands. Uh, Boris ran that election campaign, which he won, for $100. That was how much he spent on that campaign. Today, if you wanted to get a seat on the City Duma in Moscow, you either have to be in the favor of someone extremely powerful, or you might need to spend a few $1 million. in order to get that seed, because it's a sinecure that you could use for extracting resources and wealth.
Just to give that contrast, Boris ran for Moscow's city council again a year and a half ago and was arrested for his
Yeah,
efforts. So to
yeah,
give the illustration of the last 32 years, Boris ran in 1990 unobstructed. Boris ran in 2021 and was arrested.
right. And and it wasn't the first time, of course. And I will get to your point, of course, about perestroika shortly. But in 1993, of course, when there was this reaction against the privatizations that were occurring, and the shock therapy that was being applied to Russia under the rule of Boris Yeltsin. Boris was at the Russian White House, at the Russian Parliament. He was part of that group of elected officials that were looking to slow these kinds of changes down, and just to re-examine the entire model of privatizations and shock therapy generally. And there's one great example that Boris used at the time in the early 1990s to illustrate how the privatizations that were occurring were just nothing short of theft. There was a hotel in Moscow that was being privatized, and I can't remember what the price was that they were selling it to this individual for. But to illustrate the point of just how much of a ripoff it was, Boris and his colleagues had just one item in that hotel appraised, and that was its chandelier. And politically, it was very smart. It was a great way to illustrate, the degree to which this ripoff was. What he pointed to was that the price that the chandelier alone in this hotel was valued at was more than the selling price of the entire hotel. So this is a nice illustration of this kind of wide
And
scale
and
ripoff
just
that
to
was
be
occurring
clear,
at
I
the time.
believe that was the Oktyabrskaya Hotel, which was the hotel that all dignitaries, visiting dignitaries, Soviet higher ups, etc., would always stay at. So it's not only value in terms of dollars or rubles, it's also had this extraordinary value of prestige that was just being sold off and stripped for parts, and in a sense, a microcosm of the entire country, really.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I remember, in the middle of the night, for instance, in places like Riga in the 1990s. I mean, you could see a bunch of lights in cemeteries. What are these? It's moving lights. Well, they're flashlights. And what are people doing? Well, they're stripping off the bronze plaques from headstones. They're just this anything that could be taken of value was being stripped off. And so what was called the colored metals trade in the 1990s was huge. They were just stripping all of the copper, the brass, the bronze, the aluminum, whatever they could out. But now, regarding and back to the point of perestroika. So, of course, that is an opening of the economy and of the power structure somewhat. So, what Gorbachev does here is one, again, assumes with glasnost that you have this opening of society. This creates a more dynamic, open culture. Combine that with introducing what he had hoped would be on this other side of the ledger an equal dynamism in the economy by liberating company directors to produce